Colorado Territory, 1885. Barren. That was the only word Blake Whitaker could think of to describe the valley he now called home. Barren like the cupboards in his cabin. Barren like the fields that refused his crops for 2 seasons running. Barren like his life at 25. Blake stood on his porch as the sun crept below the jagged mountains ringing Forlorn Valley. A bitter wind tousled his sandy brown hair as he surveyed the land he'd purchased with his father's inheritance. The other settlers called this stretch of Colorado Territory Widow's Folly for its stubborn soil and harsh winters. They'd said no man could tame it alone. Now, 3 years in, Blake was starting to believe them. Man wasn't meant to live without voices, his mother had written in her last letter. Come home to Virginia before the West steals your soul. But Blake knew the truth. He didn't belong back east any more than he belonged here. The war had taken something from him that no comfortable parlor or Sunday social could replace. He'd seen men die screaming for mothers who'd never hold them again. He'd watched families torn apart by divided loyalties. The frontier offered solitude, and solitude meant safety. No attachments meant no loss. A man needs nothing but his horse, his rifle, and enough land to lose himself in, Blake muttered to his bay gelding, Rusty, the only creature who'd heard his voice in nearly 3 weeks. The moment you let someone matter, that's when the world takes them. The cabin behind him sat dark and unwelcoming, a crude, single-room affair with a stone fireplace and drafty windows. Its sparse furnishings included a narrow bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, though only one had ever been used, and a bookshelf containing his father's Bible and a handful of dog-eared novels. His stomach growled, reminding Blake of the dwindling provisions in his root cellar. Tomorrow he'd need to ride into Silverdale, the nearest town, some 15 miles east. A journey he dreaded more than the coming winter. As darkness claimed the valley, Blake retreated inside, lit a single lamp, and spooned the last of his beans into a tin plate. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, thinking of the cattle drive starting next month, his one chance to earn enough to keep his homestead another year. If he failed, the bank would claim the land. Not that it mattered. These days, Blake could hardly remember why he'd come west at all. The wagon wheels groaned under the weight of Sophia Turner's possessions as she guided her team along the rutted trail that wound into Forlorn Valley. At 22, with copper-colored hair piled beneath a practical bonnet and a blue calico dress that had seen better days, she presented the picture of determined femininity on the frontier. Not much farther, Maple, she assured the old mare leading her team. Then you can rest those tired legs. The journey from Silverdale had taken most of the day, but Sophia barely noticed her exhaustion. After 6 months of living with her aunt in town, working as a seamstress and saving every penny, she had finally purchased her uncle's abandoned claim at the north end of the valley. 10 acres, a small cabin, and independence, everything she'd dreamed of since her parents died of fever 3 years ago. The letter in her pocket reminded her of the risks. A woman alone has no business homesteading, her aunt had written after learning of Sophia's plans. The West devours the unprepared. Come back before winter. But Sophia knew something her aunt didn't. Life offered no guarantees, regardless of where you lived or who surrounded you. She'd watched her mother and father, both strong and capable, succumb to illness within days of each other. Their farm in Kansas, their community, their careful planning, none of it had mattered in the end. Better to risk everything on my own terms than to wait for disaster while living someone else's life, she told the disinterested horses. As the wagon crested a small rise, Sophia spotted a thin column of smoke rising from a cabin nestled against the western foothills. Her new neighbor, presumably. The land agent in Silverdale had mentioned a solitary rancher somewhere in the valley, though he'd been vague on details. Probably best to introduce myself, she murmured, checking her reflection in a small hand mirror. The journey had left smudges of dust across her fair complexion, but there was little to be done about it now. Hospitality demanded an introduction, regardless of appearances, and a neighborly visit required a neighborly offering. From beneath the wagon seat, Sophia retrieved a small basket containing the apple pie she'd baked before leaving town, still warm, wrapped in cloth. She never could have imagined how that simple pie would change everything. Blake was mending fence when he heard the wagon approaching. The sound was so unfamiliar in his isolated valley that at first, he mistook it for thunder. Only when Rusty's ears pricked forward did Blake stand, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. A single wagon, moving slowly, deliberately. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. 3 years ago, a band of outlaws had terrorized homesteaders 2 valleys over. Though nothing so dramatic had happened since, Blake maintained the wariness that frontier life demanded. The wagon followed the main trail before unexpectedly turning toward his cabin. Blake's jaw tightened. Visitors meant complications. Complications meant attachment. Attachment meant vulnerability. Still, he couldn't stand in the middle of his pasture like a statue. Reluctantly, he gathered his tools and started toward the cabin, determined to send whoever it was on their way as quickly as possible. As Blake approached, he saw the driver more clearly. A woman, alone, guiding a team with confident hands. The sight was so unexpected that he momentarily forgot his rehearsed dismissal. She pulled the wagon to a stop 20 yards from his porch and set the brake with practiced ease. When she stood, the late afternoon light caught her hair, a rich, gleaming copper that made Blake think of autumn leaves and harvest moons. Her blue calico dress was simple but well-fitted, and despite the dust of travel, there was something undeniably alive about her that made his Spartan cabin seem suddenly stark and incomplete by comparison. "Hello there," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I hope I'm not intruding." Blake found himself straightening his posture, suddenly conscious of his 3-day stubble and work-stained clothes. "Can I help you, ma'am? You're a fair ways from the main road." The woman climbed down from the wagon with a basket in hand. "I'm Sophia Turner. Just purchased the old Henderson claim up north." She approached with an easy confidence that suggested she found nothing unusual about visiting a stranger's isolated homestead. "Thought I should introduce myself, being neighbors and all." Neighbors. The word landed like a foreign language in Blake's ears. He'd chosen this valley precisely because it had no neighbors. "Blake Whitaker," he replied stiffly. "Didn't know the Henderson place had sold. Just finalized yesterday." Sophia smiled, revealing a small dimple in her right cheek. "I brought pie. Apple. Still warm, I think." She held out the basket, and Blake found himself accepting it before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples wafted up, stirring memories so long buried he'd forgotten they existed. His mother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons, family gatherings before the war, a time when food meant more than mere survival. "That's thoughtful," he managed, the words awkward on his tongue. "But unnecessary. Valley's big enough we likely won't cross paths much." Something flickered in Sophia's green eyes. Not hurt, exactly, but assessment. "Perhaps. But winter's coming, Mr. Whitaker. Out here, knowing your neighbors can be the difference between life and death when the snow falls." Blake couldn't argue with her frontier logic, though everything in him wanted to. Instead, he found himself reluctantly gesturing toward his porch. "Would you care for some coffee? It's not much, but coffee would be lovely." Sophia interrupted with another smile. "Then I'll be on my way. Still need to reach my place before dark." As Blake led her inside, he was painfully aware of how inadequate his cabin must appear to female eyes. He hadn't bothered with curtains or decorations. His mother would have called it a place for existing, not living. While he busied himself with the coffee pot on the small cast-iron stove, Sophia stood by the single window, gazing out at the valley. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "I can see why you chose it." Blake grunted noncommittally, uncomfortable with how her presence filled the empty spaces of his home. She seemed to bring color into a world he'd deliberately kept in grayscale. "What brings a woman alone to homestead in Forlorn Valley?" he asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of his question. If Sophia took offense, she didn't show it. "The same thing that brings most people west, I imagine. A fresh start." She turned from the window. "My parents died 3 years ago. Fever. Left me their farm in Kansas. But the memories were overwhelming." The simple admission stirred something in Blake. Not pity, but recognition, the shared understanding of loss that words could never fully capture. "The war took my father," he found himself saying. "Mother remarried. Virginia doesn't feel like home anymore." Sophia nodded, accepting his abbreviated history without pressing for details. "Then we're both starting over. That's something, at least." As they drank their coffee, Blake for the first time using both chairs at his table, he found himself studying her. There was a quiet determination in the set of her shoulders, a resilience that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and continued forward anyway. It was a quality he respected, even as he maintained his emotional distance. When she rose to leave, Blake found himself walking her to her wagon, then offering, "Winter comes early to the valley. If you need help preparing your place." "I appreciate that," Sophia replied. "And perhaps you'll join me for dinner sometime? I make a decent stew when supplies allow." Blake nodded noncommittally. After she departed, he stood watching until her wagon disappeared over the northern rise. Only then did he realize he was still holding the pie basket. That night, as he tasted the first home-baked food to cross his lips in years, Blake told himself the uncomfortable stirring in his chest was merely indigestion. The alternative was far too dangerous to contemplate. 2 weeks passed before Blake saw Sophia again. He'd ridden into Silverdale for supplies, spending as little time in town as possible. The general store owner, Abraham Jenkins, had tried engaging him in conversation. "Here you got a new neighbor, Whitaker. Pretty young thing, from what they say." Blake had merely grunted, paid for his goods, and left. But on the ride home, his thoughts kept returning to Sophia. Had she managed to prepare her cabin for the approaching winter? Was she finding enough game to supplement her pantry? The Henderson claim had been abandoned for years. The roof likely leaked, and the well might need clearing. These practical concerns, he assured himself, were simply those of one homesteader for another. Nothing more. As Blake crested the final hill overlooking the valley, a plume of black smoke caught his attention. Not the controlled gray of a chimney fire, but the thick, oily black of structure burning. And it was coming from the direction of the Henderson claim. Without hesitation, Blake dug his heels into Rusty's sides, abandoning his supplies by the trail as he galloped north. His heart hammered against his ribs with each stride of his horse. The rational part of his mind listed all the innocent explanations, a controlled burn of deadwood, perhaps, or clearing brush from the fields. But as he drew closer, Blake's worst fears materialized. The small barn beside Sophia's cabin was engulfed in flames, the fire licking hungrily at the dry timber. There was no sign of her. "Sophia!" he shouted, leaping from Rusty before the horse had fully stopped. "Sophia!" A horrible moment of silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the flames. Then Blake. "Here." She emerged from around the cabin, hair escaping its pins, face smudged with soot. In her arms, she clutched a small animal, a kid goat, from the looks of it. "My animals," she gasped, thrusting the goat into his arms. "Please, my horse is still inside." Before Blake could protest, Sophia was running back toward the burning barn. Without thinking, he dropped the goat and sprinted after her, catching her arm just as she reached the barn door. "Are you mad?" he shouted over the roar of the flames. Sophia struggled against his grip. "Maple's with full. I can't let her die." The desperation in her voice cut through Blake's caution. With a muttered curse, he pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. "Stay here. I'll get her." The heat inside the barn was suffocating, the smoke so thick Blake could barely see 3 feet ahead. He dropped to his knees, crawling toward the frightened whinnies coming from the far stall. Through watering eyes, he made out the form of a chestnut mare, eyes rolling white with terror, straining against her lead rope. "Easy, girl," he murmured, reaching for the rope with trembling hands. The roof beams above groaned ominously. No time for gentleness. Blake sliced through the rope with his knife and slapped the horse's flank hard. "Go!" The mare bolted past him toward the door, nearly trampling him in her panic. Blake scrambled after her, lungs burning, eyes stinging. A tremendous crack sounded above him as a support beam gave way. Something struck his shoulder, sending him sprawling face first onto the dirt floor. Then hands were grabbing him, pulling him forward. Sophia's voice, urgent and terrified. "Blake, move." Together they stumbled into the open air, just as the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. They fell to the ground, coughing and gasping. When Blake could breathe again, he found Sophia kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears that cut clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "You could have died," she said, voice breaking. "Why would you do something so foolish?" Blake had no answer that made sense, even to himself. The idea of Sophia facing such loss again, after everything she'd already endured, had simply been unacceptable. Seemed like the neighborly thing to do. he finally managed, attempting a weak smile. Sophia's laugh was part sob. Some welcome to the valley this is. Later, after ensuring the fire wouldn't spread to the cabin, Blake helped Sophia tend to her animals. The barn was a total loss, but miraculously, she'd managed to save her horse, 2 goats, and a half-dozen chickens. The approaching winter loomed like a specter over these meager beginnings. "You can't stay here," Blake said finally, surveying the damaged property. "Not with winter coming and no shelter for your livestock." Sophia's shoulders slumped. "I have nowhere else to go. My aunt in Silverdale has no room, and I've spent everything I had on this place." Blake took a deep breath, the words forming before he could reconsider their implications. "You'll come to my ranch. I have room in my barn for your animals, and—" He faltered, suddenly aware of the impropriety of what he was suggesting. Sophia's expression grew guarded. And you can use my cabin. I'll sleep in the barn until we can rebuild your place in spring." Her eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Blake interrupted firmly. "It's the sensible thing to do." As they loaded her remaining possessions into her wagon, Blake told himself this arrangement was temporary. Practical. A matter of frontier survival, nothing more. Yet as he watched Sophia gently stroke her mare's nose, whispering reassurances to the frightened animal, something unfamiliar expanded in his chest, a protectiveness that went beyond mere neighborly duty. He'd spent 3 years building walls against exactly this feeling. But as they set out toward his ranch together, Blake couldn't help wondering if those walls had ever been as strong as he pretended. The first snowfall came a week after Sophia moved into Blake's cabin. She awoke to a world transformed, the valley draped in pristine white that softened every harsh edge and concealed every imperfection. From the cabin window, she could see Blake already at work in the barn, leading her mare inside from the small corral where she'd spent the night. Their arrangement had evolved into an awkward dance of careful boundaries. Blake insisted on sleeping in the loft of his barn, despite Sophia's protests about the cold. During daylight hours, they worked separately, Blake tending livestock and mending equipment, Sophia improving the cabin's interior with small touches that transformed the space without overstepping. She'd sewn curtains from spare fabric in her trunk, added a crocheted blanket to the single chair by the fireplace, arranged her few books alongside his on the shelf. Simple things that somehow made the cabin feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Their only shared time came at supper, when Blake would arrive precisely at sundown, knock even though the cabin was technically his, and join her at the table for the meal she'd prepared. Their conversations remained purposeful at first, discussions of livestock needs, weather predictions, supply inventories, but gradually expanded to include cautious personal revelations. She learned he'd fought for the Union despite his Virginia upbringing. He discovered she'd taught school briefly in Kansas before her parents' deaths. Small pieces of themselves, offered like tentative gifts. This snowy morning, Sophia decided to bake bread, comfort against the deepening cold. As she kneaded dough on Blake's table, her gaze kept drifting to the window, tracking his movements between barn and woodshed. There was something mesmerizing about his efficiency, the quiet competence with which he moved through the world. At 25, Blake Whitaker was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional good looks, though he possessed those too. His appeal lay in the thoughtful furrow between his brows when he concentrated, the rare half-smile that transformed his serious face when something genuinely amused him, the careful gentleness of his calloused hands when tending an injured animal. A knock at the door startled Sophia from her thoughts. Blake never returned to the cabin until evening. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping flour from her hands. Blake entered, bringing a swirl of snowflakes and cold air. "Sorry to interrupt. Thought you might want to see something." Curiosity piqued, Sophia followed him outside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. Blake led her to the barn, gesturing for quiet as they entered. In a fresh bed of straw, Sophia's mare Maple lay on her side, and beside her, still damp and wobbling, stood a spindly-legged foal with a white star between its eyes. "Oh," Sophia gasped, dropping to her knees beside the new mother. She wasn't due for weeks yet. "First foals often come early," Blake said softly, kneeling beside her. "They're both doing fine." The mare nickered gently as Sophia stroked her neck, while the foal nuzzled against its mother with blind trust. Something about the scene, New life emerging despite hardship, the quiet miracle of continuation, brought unexpected tears to Sophia's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to Blake. "If you hadn't saved Maple from the fire." Their faces were close, separated by mere inches in the golden light of the barn lantern. For one breathless moment, Sophia thought he might kiss her. Something in his eyes, a hunger, a question, suggested he was considering it. Instead, Blake cleared his throat and stood. "What will you name the foal?" "Hope," Sophia said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." That evening, their supper conversation flowed more easily than ever before. The miracle of birth had somehow broken through another layer of Blake's reserve. He spoke of his childhood in Virginia, of riding horses through summer fields with his father before the war changed everything. "After he died at Antietam, something in my mother died too," Blake admitted, staring into his coffee cup. "She remarried quickly, a man who'd profited from the war while others bled. I couldn't bear to stay." "So you came west to punish yourself with solitude?" Sophia asked gently. Blake's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "I came west for independence." "There's independence, and then there's isolation," she countered. "One strengthens the spirit, the other starves it." Her words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Later, as Blake prepared to return to the barn for the night, Sophia found herself reluctant to see him go. The cabin, which had begun to feel like home, would suddenly seem empty without his presence. "It's getting colder," she said, gesturing to the window where snow continued to fall. "The barn can't possibly be comfortable." "I've slept in worse conditions," Blake replied, shrugging into his coat. Sophia gathered her courage. There's another solution. This is your home. We could share it, properly. You could take your bed, and I could make a pallet by the fire. Or," her cheeks heated despite her determination to be practical, "the bed is large enough. With a bolster between us." She trailed off as Blake's expression closed like a shutter. "That wouldn't be appropriate," he said stiffly. "We're both adults. And it's the sensible, good night, Miss Turner." Blake's formality was like a wall slamming down between them. He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Sophia stood in the middle of the cabin, frustration and hurt warring within her. "Stubborn man," she muttered to the empty room. Yet as she prepared for bed, Sophia couldn't help worrying about Blake in the frigid barn. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the wind howling around the cabin's eaves. She added an extra log to the fire, hoping its warmth somehow reached across the yard to where Blake laid his head. What she couldn't know was that Blake barely slept that night, not because of the cold, but because Sophia's offer had conjured possibilities he'd spent years denying himself. Possibilities of companionship, of shared burdens, of a life where loneliness wasn't the price of peace. Possibilities that terrified him far more than any frontier hardship ever could. December brought relentless snow and the isolation of deep winter. For 2 weeks, Blake and Sophia saw no one but each other. Their world narrowed to the boundaries of the homestead. Yet rather than chafing at the confinement, Blake found himself increasingly comfortable with Sophia's presence. She'd transformed his Spartan existence with small graces, fresh bread every third day, the scent of herbs hanging to dry from the rafters, the sound of humming as she worked. The cabin that had been merely shelter now felt like something more. Blake still slept in the barn, but spent evenings by the fire in the cabin, listening as Sophia read aloud from her small collection of books. Sometimes they simply talked, exchanging stories of their lives before the valley. Other nights they sat in comfortable silence, Blake carving a wooden horse for the shelf while Sophia mended clothing. It was during one such evening that the first sign of trouble appeared. A sound caught Blake's attention, the distant howl of wolves, closer to the homestead than he'd ever heard them. "Game must be scarce this winter," he remarked, setting aside his carving knife. Sophia looked up from her sewing. "Are they a danger to the livestock?" "Not with proper precautions," Blake assured her, though privately he was concerned. Wolves typically avoided human settlements unless desperate. Their proximity suggested unusual circumstances. The next morning confirmed his fears. Tracks circled the barn and corral, at least 6 wolves, from the pattern. Blake reinforced the corral fencing and began carrying his rifle whenever he ventured to the barn or woodshed. For 3 days, the wolves remained unseen but present, their howls punctuating the night, their tracks appearing fresh each morning. Blake's concern deepened when he discovered partially eaten deer carcasses deliberately dragged close to the property line, signs of a wolf pack grown unusually bold. Something's driving them down from the high country, he told Sophia over breakfast on the fourth day. I need to ride to the North Ridge, see what's happening. Sophia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. In this weather? Alone? It won't take more than a day. I'll be back by nightfall. And if you're not? The worry in her eyes both warmed and unsettled him. Blake, it's dangerous. The temperature's dropping again. Which is precisely why I need to understand what we're facing, he insisted. If these wolves are desperate enough to challenge a homestead, we need to know why. Sophia's expression suggested further argument, but instead, she rose and began packing food into a small sack. Take extra provisions. And your heavy coat, not the buckskin. It's too thin for this weather. Her practical concern touched something in Blake. How long had it been since anyone cared whether he returned safely from a journey? The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comfort could lead to dependency. Dependency to vulnerability. Vulnerability to loss. Yet as he prepared Rusty for the ride, Blake found himself promising, I'll be careful, and meaning it in a way that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with the woman standing in the doorway of his cabin, watching him with worried eyes. The ride north was grueling. Fresh snow concealed treacherous ground, forcing Blake to proceed slowly as he followed the wolves' trail into the foothills. By midday, he'd climbed high enough to survey much of the valley, his homestead visible as a distant cluster of buildings below. From this vantage, Blake could see what had driven the wolves down. A massive rockslide had blocked the pass they typically used to reach their winter hunting grounds. Trapped between the slide and the settled valley, the desperate pack had little choice but to venture closer to human habitation. Satisfied with his findings, Blake turned Rusty homeward. They'd barely descended a mile when the snow began falling again. Heavy, wet flakes that reduced visibility to mere yards. The temperature plummeted as the wind rose, driving ice crystals that stung like needles against any exposed skin. Blake pulled his scarf higher, grateful for Sophia's insistence on the heavier coat. Rusty plodded forward, head lowered against the gale, but their progress slowed to a crawl. By the time the valley floor came into view, darkness was falling and Blake's extremities had gone numb despite his gloves. The storm had worsened into a full blizzard, the kind that claimed unprepared travelers every winter. Blake knew he should find shelter, wait out the worst of it, but the thought of Sophia alone at the homestead with wolves circling drove him forward. When Blake finally glimpsed lights through the swirling snow, relief washed over him like a physical force. He'd made it, but his body, chilled beyond endurance, refused to cooperate. His fingers could barely grip the reins, and dismounting required all his remaining strength. Blake stumbled the final yards to the cabin door. As consciousness began to fade, he heard Sophia's voice, distant, as though underwater. Blake, dear God, you're frozen through. Strong despite her slender frame, Sophia half-carried, half-dragged him inside. Blake was vaguely aware of being stripped of his snow-crusted clothing, of being wrapped in blankets before the roaring fire, of Sophia's hands, wonderfully warm, chafing life back into his frozen fingers. Foolish, stubborn man, she murmured, her voice caught between anger and relief. What were you thinking, riding in this storm? Wolves, Blake managed through chattering teeth. Rockslide trapped them. Dangerous. Not as dangerous as your pride, Sophia countered, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. Drink this. Slowly. As warmth gradually returned to his body, clarity returned to Blake's mind. He found himself on his own bed, not by the fire where he'd assumed he was. Sophia sat beside him, her copper hair tumbling loose around her shoulders, eyes red-rimmed from what might have been tears. I thought, she stopped, swallowing hard. When I saw you collapse in the doorway, I thought you might die. The naked emotion in her voice pierced through Blake's carefully maintained defenses. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider how his loss might affect another person, how his absence might leave a hole in someone else's world. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have sheltered on the ridge. Sophia nodded, visibly composing herself. Yes, you should have. But you're here now. That's what matters. She rose to leave, but Blake caught her hand. "Stay," he said, the word carrying more meaning than he'd intended. "Please, just until I fall asleep." It was the most vulnerable request he'd made of another human being since childhood. Sophia's expression softened as she settled back beside him, her hand still in his. "I'll stay," she promised. Blake drifted toward sleep, comforted by her presence in a way he hadn't thought possible. Before consciousness fully left him, he heard Sophia whisper, "I was so afraid of losing you." In his half-dreaming state, Blake wondered when he'd become someone she could lose, and why that thought no longer frightened him as it once would have. January brought brief thaws between snowstorms, enough for Blake and Sophia to establish a new routine. Blake no longer pretended the barn was adequate shelter in the deepening winter. Instead, he slept on a pallet before the fire while Sophia took the bed, a compromise that satisfied propriety while acknowledging practical necessity. The wolves remained a constant concern. Twice they attempted to breach the corral, and once Blake shot a particularly bold male that had come within yards of the cabin. The pack's desperation only increased as winter tightened its grip. During one clear afternoon, Blake and Sophia took advantage of the fair weather to check snares he'd set along the creek bed. Their breath formed clouds in the crystalline air as they trudged through knee-deep snow. "Spring will come eventually," Sophia said, adjusting her woolen scarf. "What happens then?" The question carried weight beyond seasonal change. Blake knew she was asking about their arrangement. Would she return to her property once rebuilding became possible? Would they resume their separate lives after months of shared existence? "I suppose we'll rebuild your barn," he answered carefully, checking a snare that held a plump rabbit. "Your cabin roof needs work too." Sophia nodded, her expression unreadable. And then things returned to how they were before. Blake straightened, studying her face. Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes and copper hair, making her appear almost ethereal against the winter landscape. The thought of her leaving, of returning to his solitary existence, created an ache he couldn't ignore. "Is that what you want?" he asked. Before Sophia could answer, a sound froze them both in place. The unmistakable growl of a wolf, much too close. Blake slowly turned, instinctively positioning himself between Sophia and the threat. Not 30 yards away, 3 wolves stood watching them, gaunt, hungry creatures driven to desperation by the harsh winter. Blake's rifle remained at the cabin. He carried only a hunting knife and a small revolver with limited range. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Sophia. "Move slowly toward that stand of pines." They began edging backward, maintaining eye contact with the predators. For a moment, Blake thought they might make it to the relative safety of the trees. Then the largest wolf, a gray female with a scarred muzzle, began slinking forward, flanked by her packmates. "Run," Blake ordered, drawing his revolver. "Now!" Sophia bolted toward the pines as Blake fired a warning shot into the snow before the advancing wolves. The sound momentarily startled them, but hunger overrode their caution. The female lunged forward with frightening speed. Blake fired again, striking her shoulder. The wolf yelped, but didn't retreat. Her companions spread out, attempting to flank him. Blake backed toward the trees where Sophia waited, knowing his remaining bullets wouldn't stop all 3 wolves if they charged together. The injured female gathered herself to spring just as Blake's boot caught on hidden deadfall beneath the snow. He stumbled backward, the revolver flying from his grip as he fell. In that moment of vulnerability, the wolf launched herself toward his exposed throat. A deafening report split the air. The wolf dropped mid-leap, landing in a lifeless heap mere feet from Blake. He turned to see Sophia standing behind him, his rifle, which she must have run back to the cabin to retrieve, steady in her hands. The remaining wolves slunk away, unwilling to challenge this new threat. "Are you hurt?" Sophia demanded, keeping the rifle trained on the retreating predators. Blake rose shakily, brushing snow from his clothing. "No, thanks to you." She lowered the rifle then, and to Blake's shock, tears welled in her eyes. "I almost didn't make it back in time. I thought." Without thinking, Blake closed the distance between them and pulled Sophia into his arms. She came willingly, her body trembling against his. The rifle pressed awkwardly between them, but neither moved to adjust it. "You saved my life," Blake murmured into her hair. Sophia pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "As you saved mine, that day in the barn. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. Blake looked down at Sophia's upturned face, at the strength and vulnerability mingled in her expression, and recognized a truth he'd been fighting for months. When he lowered his mouth to hers, the kiss felt inevitable, like the natural conclusion to a story that had been writing itself since she first appeared on his doorstep with pie. Sophia's lips were cold from the winter air, but warmed quickly against his. Her free hand came up to cup his cheek, fingers gentle against his skin. The moment stretched between them, suspended in the crystalline winter afternoon. When they finally parted, Blake rested his forehead against Sophia's, unwilling to move away completely. "I don't want things to go back to how they were," he admitted quietly. "Before you came, I thought solitude was safety. Now I realize it was just another kind of prison." Sophia's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face. "Then perhaps we should consider a more permanent arrangement." Later, as they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, Blake realized the walls he'd built around his heart hadn't been demolished by some dramatic revelation. Instead, they'd been dismantled piece by piece, through shared meals and fireside conversations, through the quiet confidence of a woman who refused to be cowed by frontier hardship, through the simple, revolutionary act of allowing another person to matter. February arrived with a messenger from Silverdale, the first outside contact in weeks. Timothy Reynolds, a young rider from the general store, delivered mail and supplies, expressing amazement that he'd found them alive. "Worst winter in memory," he explained, warming himself by Blake's fire. 3 homesteads east of here lost everything. Towns organizing relief efforts. Blake and Sophia exchanged glances, both thinking of her abandoned property. "Any word on the Henderson claim?" Sophia asked. "North end of the valley?" Timothy shook his head. "Couldn't get that far. Snows drifted higher than a man's head in the northern passes." After the messenger departed, promising to return when weather allowed, Blake found Sophia standing by the window, gazing northward. "We'll check your place when the snow recedes," he promised, coming to stand behind her. "Rebuild whatever's needed." Sophia leaned back against him, allowing Blake's arms to encircle her waist. "It's strange. I was so determined to make that place my home. But now—" She turned in his embrace to face him. "Home isn't the place, is it? It's the people." Blake thought of the empty cabin he'd inhabited before Sophia's arrival. How it had been shelter, but never truly home until she filled it with warmth and purpose. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words emerging without premeditation. "Not because of convenience or circumstance, but because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you, whatever comes." Sophia's eyes widened. "Blake Whitaker, is that a proper proposal?" "Probably not," he admitted with a small smile. "But it's sincere." Her answering smile outshone the winter sun reflecting off snow. "Then my answer is yes. A very sincere yes." They were married 2 weeks later in their cabin, with only Timothy Reynolds and Abraham Jenkins from the general store as witnesses. The justice of the peace braved treacherous roads to perform the ceremony, declaring it the most romantic gesture he'd seen in 20 years of joining couples. "Not many men would ride through 3 feet of snow for a wedding," he commented, accepting a slice of Sophia's apple pie, made from preserved filling, a winter luxury. "Some things are worth the journey," Blake replied, his gaze finding his new wife across the room. Spring arrived late that year, the snow reluctantly yielding to warming temperatures. When the trails finally cleared, Blake and Sophia rode to her property to assess the damage. The cabin had survived reasonably intact, though the roof would need substantial repair. With the barn gone, however, the small homestead seemed a poor prospect for independent survival. "What if we kept both properties?" Sophia suggested as they surveyed the land. "Your ranch for cattle and horses, my claim for crops. The soil here is better for growing." Blake considered the practical wisdom of her proposal. "It would mean dividing our time between 2 places. During planting and harvest, perhaps. But we'd have one home." Sophia looked up at him, spring sunlight turning her copper hair to flame. "Your cabin, our cabin, is where I want to be." By summer, they had implemented Sophia's plan. The Henderson claim became productive farmland, yielding vegetables for their table and extra to trade in Silverdale. Blake's ranch expanded its cattle operation, his isolation replaced by regular commerce with neighboring valleys. Their cabin grew too. First with an additional room that autumn, then with a proper second bedroom the following spring when Sophia announced she was expecting their first child. The valley that had once felt barren to Blake now teemed with possibility and life. On an autumn evening much like the one when Sophia had first arrived with Pi, Blake sat on his porch, their porch, watching his wife in the garden with their infant daughter, Catherine. The little girl's copper curls matched her mother's, though her serious expression was pure Blake, according to Sophia. Blake marveled at how completely his life had transformed in 2 short years. The man who had once defined safety as absence, of attachment, of risk, of loss, now found his greatest security in presence, in family, in love that acknowledged the fragility of life while celebrating its abundance. When Sophia approached the porch, baby on her hip and a basket of late tomatoes in her free arm, Blake rose to meet her. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. Blake took their daughter, who immediately reached for his face with pudgy hands. "I was thinking about pie," he admitted with a smile. "Were you now?" Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Any particular kind?" "Apple. The kind that appears on a lonely man's doorstep and changes everything." Sophia's laugh, still his favorite sound, floated across the homestead that had become a home. "Well then, Mr. Whitaker, I believe I might be persuaded to bake one. For old time's sake." As they moved together into the warmth of their cabin, Blake silently thanked whatever fortune, fate, or providence had guided Sophia Turner to his door that autumn day. The loneliest cowboy in the valley had found not just companionship but completion, proof that even in the harshest landscape, love could take root and flourish. And it had all begun with Pi.